June 24, 1944. The skies above Iwo Jima. Flight Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai climbed through 12,000 feet in his Mitsubishi Zero, scanning the horizon with the practiced eye of a veteran who had survived 3 years of aerial combat. 64 confirmed kills. One of Japan's most decorated fighter aces. He had fought American pilots from the Philippines to Guadalcanal, had learned their tactics, exploited their weaknesses, and always maintained the altitude advantage that made the Zero invincible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then he saw them. 15 aircraft approaching from the southeast. The distinctive silhouette he'd been briefed about, but never truly believed. Grumman F6F Hellcats. American carrier fighters that intelligence reports claimed were different from the clumsy Wildcats. He'd been shooting down for years, but Sakai had heard these stories before. New American aircraft, better engines, improved performance. The reports always exaggerated. The Zero remained supreme in the one metric that mattered most in aerial combat. Climb rate. Sakai initiated his standard attack profile. Climb above the enemy formation. Position for a diving attack. Use the Zero's superior maneuverability to control the engagement. It was the same tactical doctrine that had worked against every American fighter since Pearl Harbor. Except this time, something was different. The Hellcats weren't struggling to gain altitude. They were climbing. Fast. Impossibly fast. At 3,500 feet per minute. Faster than anything Sakai had ever encountered. Faster than his own Zero. Faster than the laws of physics should have allowed for an aircraft that heavy. By the time Sakai realized his mistake, 4 Hellcats had already positioned themselves above him. The altitude advantage that he'd counted on for his entire combat career had evaporated in less than 3 minutes. Everything Japanese fighter doctrine believed about American aircraft was about to shatter, because sometimes the most impossible performance becomes the deadliest weapon. The morning after Pearl Harbor had changed more than America's strategic position in the Pacific. It destroyed the fundamental assumptions American naval aviation had made about fighter design. As smoke still rose from the wreckage in Hawaii, engineering teams at Grumman Aircraft Corporation in Bethpage, New York, gathered around performance data that painted a devastating picture of American capabilities against Japan's war machine. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had become a legend overnight. Japanese pilots were cutting through American formations with surgical precision. Their fighters dancing through the sky with an agility that seemed almost supernatural. The Zero could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver anything the United States Navy could put in the air at altitudes below 14,000 feet. American pilots flying F4F Wildcats were dying, and their complaints were consistent. The Wildcat was too slow in a climb, too sluggish in acceleration, too underpowered for the combat environment they faced. The statistics were brutal. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Zero maintained a kill ratio of better than 3-to-1 against American fighters. Every engagement report told the same story. American pilots who followed their training, who executed textbook tactics, who did everything right, were still being shot down because their aircraft simply couldn't match Zero performance in the vertical plane. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare understood this better than most. At 27 years old, with 7 confirmed kills and the Medal of Honor around his neck, O'Hare had survived more Zero encounters than nearly any American pilot in the Pacific. On April 22, 1942, he walked through the front doors of Grumman's Bethpage factory, carrying information that would determine whether America could win the air war. William Schwendler, Grumman's chief designer, had been working on a replacement for the Wildcat since 1941. 38 years old, 15 years designing naval aircraft, Schwendler knew the Wildcat's limitations intimately. But knowing a problem existed and understanding how to solve it were 2 different challenges. The contract for the prototype F6F had been signed on June 30, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The design specifications called for improved performance across every metric, but the prototype hadn't flown yet, and Schwendler wasn't certain whether the improvements would be enough. O'Hare spent 4 hours with Schwendler and the Grumman design team. He described Zero tactics in granular detail, how they baited American pilots into turning fights, how they used their superior climb rate to maintain altitude advantage throughout every engagement, how they could accelerate vertically when American fighters stalled and fell into vulnerable positions. The specific performance gap that was killing American pilots wasn't horizontal speed or turning radius, it was vertical performance. Climb rate, the ability to convert engine power into altitude faster than your opponent. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Schwendler took 18 pages of notes. He asked about zero climb rates at different altitudes, about the specific power settings Japanese pilots used during vertical maneuvers, about the exact moments during combat when American pilots lost their altitude advantage and found themselves in defensive positions. O'Hare provided everything he could remember. The Wildcat's Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine produced 1,200 horsepower. It wasn't enough. The new fighter needed at least 2,000 horsepower, preferably more, enough to climb faster than a Zero above 10,000 feet, enough to outrun a Zero in level flight at all altitudes. Schwendler mentioned the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders, air-cooled, producing 2,000 horsepower. It was already being used in the Vought F4U Corsair. Could Grumman use it in the F6F? O'Hare's answer was immediate and unequivocal. Yes, absolutely. Whatever it took to get more power. The entire Pacific Air War depended on having a fighter that could match or exceed Zero performance in the vertical plane. Everything else was secondary. 4 days later, on April 26, 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics sent Grumman a directive. Install the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine in the second F6F prototype. Redesign the airframe to handle the additional power. Mount the cockpit higher in the fuselage for improved visibility. Install hydraulic landing gear. Add whatever armor protection the structure could support. Build it as fast as possible. The Navy needed this fighter in combat by mid-1943 at the latest. The engineering challenges were substantial. The R2800 engine weighed significantly more than the original Wright Cyclone. It required a larger engine mount, a bigger propeller, reinforced wing spars to handle the increased torque. The entire aircraft would grow heavier, but the power increase would be dramatic. 2,000 horsepower versus 1,200, a 67% improvement in available power. If Grumman's calculations were correct, that power would translate directly into vertical performance. On July 30th, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall took the prototype F6F3 on its first flight. The aircraft climbed away from Bethpage Field with an acceleration that exceeded every prediction. Hall flew for 45 minutes, testing climb rate, maximum speed, control responsiveness, stall characteristics. When he landed, his report was succinct. The aircraft climbed like nothing he'd ever flown. At maximum power, the R2800 engine pulled the Hellcat skyward at rates approaching 3,500 feet per minute at sea level. Even more importantly, that climbing power remained effective at high altitudes, where thinner air usually robbed fighters of vertical performance. The tactical implications were staggering. An American fighter that could outclimb a Zero would reverse every assumption Japanese pilots had made about aerial combat in the Pacific. The altitude advantage that had made the Zero invincible would disappear. American pilots would no longer need to fear vertical engagements. They could climb above their opponents, control the fight, and attack from positions of strength. Production began immediately. The Navy couldn't wait for extended testing. American pilots were dying in aircraft that couldn't compete with the Zero, and every month of delay meant more casualties. Grumman's factory ramped up production with unprecedented speed. 12 aircraft in the last quarter of 1942, 128 in the first quarter of 1943, 130 in April alone. By summer 1943, Grumman was producing 500 Hellcats per month. Every single aircraft incorporated the changes O'Hare had recommended in that 4-hour meeting. The massive R2800 engine, the raised cockpit with improved visibility, the hydraulic landing gear that freed pilots from manually cranking their wheels up and down during combat, the armor protection around the cockpit and fuel tanks, and most critically, the power to climb at 3,500 feet per minute, transforming the Hellcat from a defensive fighter into an offensive weapon. The first Hellcat squadron to receive aircraft was Fighting Squadron 9, based at Naval Air Station, Norfolk, Virginia. They received their first F6F 3 seconds in January 1943. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey was the squadron commander. 31 years old, 9 years in naval aviation, Torrey had flown Wildcats in combat and knew exactly how outmatched they were against Zeros. When he saw the Hellcat for the first time, he couldn't reconcile the aircraft sitting on the tarmac with the Wildcat he'd been flying 6 months earlier. The Hellcat was bigger, 33 feet 7 inches long versus 28 feet 10 inches for the Wildcat. Wingspan 42 feet 10 inches versus 38 feet. Empty weight 9,238 pounds versus 5,758 pounds. But the Hellcat was faster. 380 miles per hour, maximum speed at 17,300 feet versus 318 for the Wildcat. And the climb rate, 3,500 feet per minute versus 2,300, a 52% improvement in vertical performance. Torrey told his pilots this aircraft would change everything. The days of running from Zeros were over. The days of defensive tactics designed to compensate for inferior climb performance were finished. Now they could fight. Now they could climb above any Japanese fighter and attack from altitude. The power advantage was overwhelming. Fighting Squadron 9 trained intensively for 5 months. They practiced gunnery, formation flying, carrier landings, combat tactics, specifically designed to exploit the Hellcat's vertical performance. The improved visibility made formation flying safer. The extra power made every maneuver easier. But pilots had to adjust their thinking. The Hellcat was heavier than the Wildcat. It required different approach speeds for landing, different power settings for various flight regimes, and most importantly, different tactics that emphasized vertical maneuvering over horizontal turning fights. By August 1943, VF-9 was ready for combat. They deployed aboard the carrier Essex as part of Task Force 15. The task force included the carriers Essex, Yorktown, and light carrier Independence. Task Force 15 was the first carrier group equipped entirely with Hellcats, no more Wildcats. Every fighter in the task force was an F6F. This was the combat debut of America's new naval fighter. The target was Marcus Island, a small Japanese base 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. The base had airfields, radar installations, supply depots. It was defended by approximately 35 aircraft, mostly Zeros, and heavy anti-aircraft batteries. Task Force 15 would strike at dawn on August 31st, 1943. At 4:15 a.m., aircraft began launching from the carriers. Torrey led VF-9 off the Essex. The Hellcats formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and headed toward Marcus Island. They arrived at 5:50 a.m., just as the sun rose over the Pacific. Torrey's division dove first. They came in from the east with the sun behind them. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. No fighters scrambled to intercept. Torrey's division destroyed 6 aircraft on the ground in the first pass, then climbed back to altitude for a second run. The raid was a complete success. More importantly, the Hellcat had proven itself in combat. It performed exactly as designed: fast, powerful, tough. Pilots returned to the carriers with enthusiastic reports. The aircraft climbed with authority, maintaining altitude advantage throughout the entire engagement. This was the fighter America needed. The first aerial combat came on September 1st, when Hellcats from the Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch and Ensign Arthur Nyquist shot it down. the first aerial victory for the Hellcat. More engagements followed rapidly. On October 5th, Hellcats from 4 carriers struck Wake Island. They encountered 34 Zeros. The engagement would provide the first test of the Hellcat's vertical performance against experienced Japanese pilots flying the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for nearly 2 years. The Zeros attacked aggressively, using the same tactics that had devastated Wildcats since Pearl Harbor. They attempted to climb above the American formation, position for diving attacks, control the engagement through altitude advantage. But the Hellcats climbed faster. American pilots found themselves above the Zeros within minutes of the engagement starting. The altitude superiority that Japanese pilots had counted on for their entire combat careers was gone. The Hellcats shot down 22 Zeros and lost 6 aircraft. 4 to Zeros, 2 to anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was better than 3 to 1, far better than the Wildcat had ever achieved. But more importantly, American pilots had maintained altitude advantage throughout the engagement. The Hellcat's climb rate had reversed the tactical dynamic of Pacific air combat. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. The Hellcat wasn't just better than the Wildcat, it was better than the Zero in the one performance metric that mattered most: vertical maneuvering, climb rate, the ability to gain and maintain altitude advantage. American pilots finally had an aircraft that could compete with Japanese fighters on equal terms, better than equal terms. The Hellcat could outclimb the Zero at altitudes above 14,000 feet, where most combat occurred. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The real test came on December 4th, 1943, at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. 91 Hellcats from 3 carriers encountered 50 Zeros defending the atoll. The Zeros attacked aggressively, using the vertical tactics that had worked against every American fighter since Pearl Harbor. But this time, those tactics failed completely. The Hellcats were faster in a climb. They had more power. When Zeros tried to gain altitude advantage, Hellcats followed them up and exceeded their climb rate. When Zeros tried to dive away, Hellcats could follow them down and maintain pursuit. The performance gap had reversed entirely. Now the Americans had the better aircraft in vertical maneuvering. The battle lasted 37 minutes. The Hellcats shot down 28 Zeros. Only 2 Hellcats were lost. The kill ratio was 14 to 1. It was the most lopsided aerial victory American naval aviation had achieved against Japanese fighters in the entire war, and it proved conclusively that the Hellcat was superior to the Zero in the one performance characteristic that determined survival in aerial combat. Vertical performance. American pilots returned from Kwajalein with a confidence they hadn't felt since before Pearl Harbor. The aircraft they were flying could outclimb, outrun, and outlast any Japanese fighter in the Pacific. The psychological advantage had shifted completely. Japanese pilots who had dominated the skies for 2 years were suddenly facing opponents who held altitude superiority, who could climb above them, who could control every engagement. By the end of December 1943, 6 carrier air groups were equipped with Hellcats. More were in training. The Navy's entire fighter force was transitioning to the F6F. The Wildcat was being relegated to escort carriers, where its shorter takeoff distance remained advantageous. The Hellcat had become the standard fleet carrier fighter, and pilots loved it. Not because it was the fastest fighter in the world, not because it was the most maneuverable, but because it could climb at 3,500 feet per minute and give them the altitude advantage that meant the difference between life and death. The Japanese noticed the change in late 1943. Pilot reports from Japanese carrier and land-based air groups mentioned that American fighters were performing differently. They were faster in vertical maneuvers, more aggressive in climbing engagements, harder to evade when they established altitude superiority. Tactics that had worked reliably against Wildcats were failing against these new aircraft. Japanese intelligence designated the Hellcat as Grumman 6, distinguishing it from the earlier Grumman 4 Wildcat. but identifying the aircraft was easier than countering it. The performance advantage was real and measurable. American fighters could now climb faster than Zeros at critical combat altitudes. That single performance characteristic changed everything. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. He knew how to exploit Wildcat weaknesses, how to use the Zero's superior climb rate to maintain altitude advantage, how to position for diving attacks that American fighters couldn't counter. But in February 1944, Sakai engaged a Hellcat over Rabaul and discovered those old tactics didn't work anymore. Sakai tried his standard approach. Position the Zero at altitude, wait for the American to commit to an attack run, reverse course and dive to get behind the American during the climb-out. It had worked dozens of times against Wildcats. The timing was precise. Wildcats climbed slowly enough that a Zero pilot could complete a diving reversal and position for a killing shot before the American reached safe altitude. But the Hellcat climbed faster than Sakai expected, much faster. By the time he completed his dive and pulled up, the Hellcat was already back at altitude and positioning for a counterattack. Sakai had to break off and run. It was the first time in his combat career he'd been forced to disengage from a defensive position against an American fighter. The experience was profoundly unsettling. The fundamental tactical assumptions that had made the Zero invincible were no longer valid. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, attacking with superior speed, then climbing back to safe positions. But their aircraft were executing those tactics faster and more effectively. The performance gap was small, fractional in some cases, but enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had spent years learning to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed Hellcats, looking for modifications or new equipment. They found nothing unusual. The Hellcat was simply a better aircraft. It had more power, better speed, superior climb rate. The engine was bigger, the airframe was stronger. Everything about it was designed to outperform the Zero in vertical maneuvering at the altitudes where most combat occurred. The Japanese tried to adapt their tactics. Some pilots became more cautious, avoiding engagements unless they had numerical superiority. Other pilots became more aggressive, trying to force turning fights where the Zero still maintained advantages at low speeds. But both approaches had problems. Cautious flying meant giving up the initiative. Aggressive flying meant taking more risks against an aircraft that could absorb damage the Zero couldn't. Either way, Japanese pilots were losing. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier aviation was in crisis. They'd lost most of their experienced pilots at Midway and during the Solomon Islands campaign. The replacements were hastily trained and inexperienced. They were flying an aircraft, the Zero, that was optimized for 1941 combat conditions, and they were facing American pilots, flying Hellcats, designed specifically to counter Zero tactics based on direct combat feedback from Medal of Honor recipients who had survived years of fighting in inferior aircraft. The result was predictable and devastating. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became the defining moment for the Hellcat's vertical performance advantage. 15 American carriers with 480 Hellcats faced 9 Japanese carriers with 370 aircraft, mostly Zeros. The Japanese launched 4 massive raids against the American fleet. The Hellcats intercepted every raid before it reached the carriers. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, understood the tactical revolution created by the Hellcat's climb rate better than most squadron leaders. His pilots had trained extensively in vertical fighting techniques, learning to use their superior climbing performance to control every aspect of aerial engagement. When radar detected the first Japanese raid at 90 miles distance, McCampbell immediately ordered his Hellcats to maximum climb power. The Hamilton Standard propellers bit into the thin air with unprecedented efficiency. pulling the heavy American fighters skyward at rates that exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. At 22,000 feet, McCampbell's Hellcats achieved visual contact with the incoming Japanese formation, still climbing toward what they assumed would be their altitude advantage. But the Americans continued climbing past them, reaching 28,000 feet before leveling off in perfect attack position. Ensign Thomas Williams, now a seasoned combat veteran with 12 confirmed kills, flew as part of McCampbell's formation. Williams had survived the dark early months of the Pacific War, when American pilots flew inferior aircraft against superior opponents. The transformation created by the Hellcat's vertical performance was personal for Williams. It represented the difference between flying defensively and fighting aggressively, between hoping to survive and expecting to win. For Japanese pilots in the formation below, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. They'd spent 3 years dominating aerial engagements by maintaining altitude superiority. Now they found themselves looking up at American fighters that had outclimbed their legendary Zeros. Pilots who had never lost an altitude advantage suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar defensive positions. Their radios crackled with confused reports. Disbelief that the heavy American fighters had achieved superior altitude despite launching later and climbing through the same air mass. McCampbell's attack began with textbook precision. Diving from 28,000 feet with the massive kinetic energy advantage that altitude provided, the Hellcats accelerated through the dive with tremendous authority. Their powerful engines and robust airframes converting gravitational potential energy into devastating attack speed. Williams selected a Zero, attempting to turn away from the diving Americans, knowing that his aircraft's superior power would allow him to maintain attack position throughout the engagement. The turning battle that followed demonstrated the complete reversal of Pacific air combat dynamics. Where Zeros had once used their agility to evade American attacks and position for counterstrikes, they now found themselves unable to escape Hellcats that could match their turning performance while maintaining superior energy levels. The massive R-2800 engines provided not just climbing advantage, but sustained power throughout complex maneuvering that left Japanese pilots struggling to maintain defensive positions. Sakai himself, now flying with reduced vision from his 1942 wounds but still commanding a Zero squadron, engaged Williams in a vertical climbing duel that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The Japanese pilot pulled his aircraft into a steep climb, expecting the heavy American fighter to stall or lose energy, as Wildcats and early model fighters had done countless times before. Instead, Williams's Hellcat climbed with him, the massive propeller converting every ounce of the R-2800 engine's power into vertical performance that matched and then exceeded the Zero's legendary capabilities. At 15,000 feet, the Zero began to lose energy, the thin air and limited engine power forcing Sakai to level off or risk stalling. But Williams's Hellcat continued climbing with authority, the 3,500 foot per minute climb rate remaining effective even at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled. Williams gained another 2,000 feet of altitude, rolled inverted, and dove back onto Sakai's position with overwhelming energy advantage. Sakai survived the engagement through skill and experience, diving away and using cloud cover to break visual contact. But his aircraft was badly damaged, and his squadron had been decimated. As he nursed his crippled Zero back toward base, Sakai understood that something fundamental had changed in the Pacific Air War. The altitude advantage that had made Japanese fighters invincible was gone, ended not by revolutionary new American tactics, but by a single performance characteristic: climb rate, the ability to gain altitude faster than your opponent. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but its outcome reshaped the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War. McCampbell's squadron shot down 29 Japanese aircraft while losing only 2 Hellcats, a kill ratio of nearly 15-1 that would have been impossible without the climbing performance advantage. Across the entire battle, American pilots achieved similar results, destroying over 400 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The battle's aftermath revealed the full scope of the Hellcat's vertical performance revolution. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses sustained during the Marianas operation. They lacked both the aircraft and experienced pilots necessary to continue effective carrier operations. The Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to project air power across the Pacific had been broken by American fighters that could climb faster, fight longer, and dominate engagements the Japanese pilots had once controlled through altitude superiority. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese tactical analysts studying the Marianas disaster reached conclusions that would fundamentally alter their fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war. Combat reports from surviving pilots were consistent and undeniable. American Hellcats could outclimb Zeros at altitudes above 14,000 feet. The performance advantage was measurable, repeatable, and tactically decisive. Japanese fighters could no longer rely on vertical maneuvering to gain advantageous positions against American formations. In August 1944, Japanese Naval Air Command issued new tactical guidance to all fighter squadrons. The directive was unprecedented in its acknowledgement of American technical superiority. Fighter pilots were instructed to avoid vertical combat against F6F Hellcats whenever possible. If engaged by Hellcats at altitude, pilots were ordered to dive away immediately rather than attempt climbing maneuvers. The fundamental principle of Japanese fighter doctrine, gaining and maintaining altitude superiority, had been invalidated by American engineering. The tactical implications rippled through every level of Japanese air operations. Fighter sweeps that had once climbed to intercept American formations were now ordered to operate at lower altitudes, where zero maneuverability provided marginal advantages. Bomber escort missions that had relied on fighters maintaining altitude superiority were restructured to emphasize defensive formations. Even kamikaze operations were planned around the assumption that Japanese aircraft could not gain altitude advantage against defending Hellcats. For Japanese pilots who had spent years training in tactics that emphasized vertical maneuvering, the new doctrine was psychologically devastating. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, a Zero pilot with 18 confirmed kills, described the change in a letter to his family. "We have been ordered not to climb against the American Grumman fighters. This goes against everything we have learned, everything we have practiced. But pilots who ignore this order do not return from their missions." The directive wasn't just tactical guidance. It was an admission that Japanese fighter design had been surpassed by American engineering. The Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies for 3 years through superior climb rate and maneuverability, could no longer compete in vertical combat against the Hellcat. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. They were being ordered to fight defensively, to avoid the type of aggressive climbing tactics that had made them successful, to acknowledge that American fighters were now superior in the one performance metric that determined control of aerial combat. American intelligence intercepted communications, referring to the new Japanese tactical doctrine within weeks of its implementation. Navy analysts were initially skeptical that Japanese commanders would issue such explicit instructions, acknowledging Hellcat superiority. But pilot interrogations and captured documents confirmed the directive's existence. Japanese fighter pilots were being told, in official tactical guidance, never to fight vertical against F6F Hellcats. The confirmation validated every decision Grumman had made in the Hellcat's design. The emphasis on climb rate over maneuverability, the massive R2800 engine despite the weight penalty, the 3,500 foot per minute vertical performance that had seemed excessive during initial testing. All of it had been justified by combat results that forced Japanese commanders to abandon their fundamental tactical doctrine. Commander McCampbell, now the Navy's leading ace, received briefings on the Japanese tactical changes in September 1944. His response was characteristically direct. "They figured out what we already knew. You can't beat a Hellcat in a climb. Not at combat altitudes, not with a Zero. Their pilots were dying, trying to maintain altitude advantage they couldn't achieve. The smart ones stopped trying." but the tactical adjustment came too late to save Japanese air power in the Pacific. The Hellcat had already achieved air superiority, and American production was flooding the theatre with aircraft Japanese industry couldn't match. By October 1944, Task Force 38 operated with over 1,000 aircraft, more than half of them Hellcats. The numerical advantage combined with performance superiority created conditions where Japanese pilots faced overwhelming odds in every engagement. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the final demonstration of the Hellcat's dominance in vertical combat. Japanese naval aviation committed its remaining strength to the Philippines campaign, launching hundreds of aircraft against American carrier task forces. Hellcat squadrons intercepted every major raid, maintaining altitude superiority throughout multi-day operations that destroyed Japanese air power as an effective fighting force. On October 24th, McCampbell and his wingman Ensign Roy Rushing engaged 60 Japanese aircraft in an encounter that became legendary in naval aviation. The two Hellcats climbed above the massive Japanese formation, gained altitude advantage through superior climb rate, then systematically attacked from above for over 90 minutes. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft. Rushing shot down 6. Together they destroyed 15 aircraft in one mission, exploiting the altitude advantage their Hellcats could gain and maintain against any Japanese fighter. McCampbell landed aboard the carrier Langley with 2 rounds of ammunition remaining and fuel tanks nearly empty. He'd been airborne so long that carrier deck crews had given him up for lost. His after-action report emphasized the critical importance of the Hellcat's climb rate. "We controlled the entire engagement because we could climb above them and stay above them. Every attack was from altitude. Every disengagement was a climb back to superior position. The Japanese couldn't follow us up. They tried, but their aircraft couldn't match our climb rate at 15,000 feet and above." Sakai, who survived the Philippines campaign through caution and skill, later wrote about the psychological impact of facing Hellcats that could outclimb his Zero. "We knew before entering combat that we could not gain altitude advantage. The American fighters would climb above us regardless of our tactics. This knowledge affected every decision, every maneuver. We were fighting defensively from the moment we encountered them. It was impossible to be aggressive when you knew the enemy would always have superior position." The admission was remarkable, coming from one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots. Sakai had built his combat record by gaining and maintaining altitude superiority, by using the Zero's climb rate to position for advantageous attacks. By controlling engagements through vertical maneuvering, the Hellcat had invalidated every technique that had made him successful. The 3,500 foot per minute climb rate had changed the fundamental dynamics of aerial combat in ways that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. By November 1944, the tactical guidance to avoid vertical combat against Hellcats had become standard operating procedure throughout Japanese naval aviation. Flight training programs emphasized horizontal maneuvers and low-altitude tactics. New pilots were explicitly taught that American Grumman fighters possessed superior climb rates and that vertical engagements were to be avoided. The doctrine that had once emphasized aggressive altitude superiority had been replaced with defensive tactics designed to minimize the Hellcat's performance advantages. But defensive tactics couldn't compensate for the loss of altitude control. Fighters operating at low altitudes were vulnerable to diving attacks from Hellcats operating above them. Horizontal maneuvers were energy-intensive and left Japanese pilots in vulnerable positions when Hellcats climbed away and repositioned for follow-up attacks. The tactical adjustments Japanese commanders implemented acknowledged Hellcat superiority without providing effective countermeasures. American pilots, reading intelligence summaries about Japanese tactical changes, understood they'd achieved something unprecedented. They'd forced an enemy to abandon fundamental combat doctrine through superior aircraft performance. Lieutenant Williams, now with 19 confirmed kills, described it in a letter home. "The Japanese pilots know they can't climb with us. They've been ordered not to try. That means we control every fight before it starts. We can climb above them, attack from altitude, and climb away if things get complicated. They can't follow us up, and they know it. That psychological edge is as important as the actual performance difference. The final months of 1944 brought increasingly desperate Japanese tactics as American forces approached the Philippines and prepared for operations against Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. Kamikaze attacks became the primary Japanese response to American naval superiority, replacing conventional fighter tactics with suicide missions designed to overwhelm defensive screens through numbers rather than skill. Kamikaze operations were affected by the Hellcat's vertical performance. American fighters maintained combat air patrols at high altitudes, using their superior climb rates to intercept incoming attacks before they reached vulnerable shipping. Hellcat pilots could spot kamikaze formations at extreme ranges, climb to superior positions, then dive through the formations in high-speed attack runs that destroyed Japanese aircraft before they could threaten American vessels. The tactical doctrine to avoid vertical combat against F6F Hellcats remained in effect through the end of the war. Japanese fighter pilots operating in defense of Okinawa in April 1945 and over the home islands during the final months of the conflict were still instructed to avoid climbing engagements with American fighters. The directive that had been issued as emergency guidance in August 1944 had become permanent doctrine, acknowledgement that Japanese fighter design could not compete with American engineering in the performance metric that mattered most. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, ended the Pacific War before the full implications of the Hellcat's vertical performance dominance could be measured in an invasion of Japan. But the technical and tactical lessons learned from 3 years of combat operations fundamentally changed how air forces around the world understood fighter design. Grumman's engineering teams, analyzing combat data from thousands of Hellcat sorties, discovered that climb rate had been the single most important performance characteristic in determining combat outcomes. Aircraft with superior horizontal speed or tighter turning radius still lost engagements if they couldn't maintain altitude advantage. The Hellcat's 3,500 foot per minute climb rate had been more tactically significant than any other performance metric. The data was comprehensive and undeniable. Hellcats achieved a final kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. 306 pilots became aces flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat during the entire war. The aircraft had dominated Pacific skies through a combination of superior climb rate, rugged construction, and tactical doctrine that exploited vertical performance advantages. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.